I'm delighted to introduce to you David Pascoe, who is Professor of English Literature and Culture at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. His research interests lie in the interactions between literary and visual culture and technology, and his publications, there are many, but they include, amongst these, aircraft and airspaces, highly recommended books. So please help me in welcoming David to the podium. Thanks.
Well, hello. I should like to thank, before we start, Charles and Sonia for their constant vigilance, ensuring that the various trajectories of these talks today haven't really collided, even though they have converged. It seems to me that they've put together a beautiful program. Before I go any further, I need to make a formal acknowledgement that these images, some of these films that I'm going to be showing you, are by an Italian plane spotter called Marco Gismondi. This one's just about to start us off. Good. While that's playing, I just wanted to also make an apology, because as I speak above the noise of the jet coming in, I suggest that most of the people in this building are working around built environments. But my world is a little bit different. My world is a world of represented environments, represented worlds. It's a world of words, and that's to say of meanings, but also of sounds. And I wanted to talk for the next 30 minutes or so about representing airport landscapes in words. And I wanted to concentrate, and I'm going to concentrate, on a couple of major contemporary British writers to look at the way that they represent the airport environment around Heathrow Airport in London. Some of you will know it, most of you will hate it. Now, these writers don't follow the late Dennis Cosgrove in suggesting a link with the tradition of 18th century landscape gardening. Instead, as we'll see, they stress the discontinuities of the airport environment. In particular, its largely accidental relationship to the suburbs of West London. Just over 40 years ago, in June 1973, the British writer J.G. Ballard published a book entitled Crash. Some of you may have seen David Cronenberg's 1996 remake, which transplants the action to Toronto. And we are seeing a car crash happening in Toronto this week before our very eyes, involving the mayor. But back to 1973. Ballard later described this novel as, quote, the first pornographic novel based on technology, and it certainly landed with a bang. Its plot, such as it exists, is banally repetitious. James Ballard, the narrator, is a bored advertising copywriter living in Shepperton, a dormitory suburb situated southwest of London, in the shadow of Heathrow. When Ballard's car collides with another vehicle on one of the airport's approach roads, badly injuring its driver and killing her husband, a brand new world of chance sexual possibility begins to make itself apparent, manifesting itself as a series of mechanical couplings with the victim at various locations within the airport landscape. And all of these are described in the forensic procedural detail that befits the real J.G. Ballard, a writer who was born in 1930 and who died in 2009, a writer who by his mid-20s had trained first of all to be a doctor, and then, having abandoned his medical studies, trained to be an RAF pilot. To understand that ecology, that relationship of being an environment, it's necessary to look beyond the couplings in this novel and to survey the locale of Crash, the landscape onto which the sexual acts are very precisely mapped. Could we play this, please? And that landscape are the roads approaching and then encircling London Airport to the west of the capital. That brutal, erotic, and overlit realm, as far as Ballard describes it, that, quote, beckons more and more persuasively to us from the margins of the technological landscape. Now, landscape, of course, has always been a matter of perspective in process, a scopic perception. The experience of a landscape, of an airport landscape, will differ depending on the point of view of the beholder. The process that Frederick Jameson has famously termed cognitive mapping will not be coterminous for somebody sitting comfortably in a departure lounge, gazing out over the apron, or one standing at the blast zone at the end of a runway, or one living under the glide path. Framed by paths of flight, the recurrent and routinized sexual performances of crash take place in a landscape made up of the service areas, the perimeter roads, the concrete flyovers, the echoing multi-story car parks, and ink-black reservoirs that surround the airport simply known as London. To put it very bluntly, these characters fuck with the landscape. And the power of Ballard's vision is to suggest that in this they merely reflect the airport environment. Another celebrated writer based in London, Ian Sinclair, has over the last 2 decades spent a good deal of time with Ballard, with his life and his work. And in 1997, he summed up the earlier writer's place as follows. Ballard at Shepperton, the reservoirs, the airport perimeter roads, the empty film studios. Shepperton, as I said, is a dormitory town of about 10,000 people to the southwest of London. There in on the map on the top left, you'll see its precise location in relation to Heathrow, but also in relation to the media capitals within the capital city of London, Soho and Teddington and Pinewood, which all are places where the British film industry thrives still. And this is the world of J.G. Ballard. He moved to the town in 1960 with his young family, and he lived in this house, 36 Old Charlton Road. There's his address, his full address, his postal address, should you wish to get in touch with him, although he died in 2009. But nevertheless, in recent years, his 1930s semi-detached house has become a site of pilgrimage. More of that later. For his part, Ballard liked to situate himself within the environs of Heathrow Airport. And he wrote in 1997, in a very famous essay called The Ultimate Departure Lounge, he wrote about Heathrow as follows. The catchment area of Heathrow extends for at least 10 miles to its south and west, a zone of motorway intersections, dual carriageways, science parks, marinas, and industrial estates, watched by police CCTV speed check cameras, a landscape which most people affect to loathe, but which I regard as the most advanced and admirable in the British Isles, and a paradigm for the best the future offers us. The geographical coordinates are extremely precise, 10 miles to the south and west. That locates Ballard precisely in Shepperton. And it confirms his very frequently stated idea, his concept, that the suburban commuter towns of London are the suburbs not, in fact, of London, but of the airport. In this same article, published in Blueprint magazine in 1997, and thereafter syndicated worldwide, Ballard sets out, in terms both hard and fast, his idea that the airport landscape was not simply a gateway to infinite possibilities that only the sky can offer, but also, since it was designed around the needs of collaborating technologies, it actually contained modern existence, its transience, its alienation, and its discontinuity. But most important was, according to Ballard, that was the brutal fact that, quote, under the flight paths of Heathrow, everything is designed for the next 5 minutes. In terms of flight operations, Ballard, a trained RAF pilot, knew that the 5 minutes after takeoff and prior to landing concentrate the mind and the matter of life and death wonderfully. Almost exactly a year before Crash was published in 1973, and just as Ballard was completing its composition, an air accident took place a few miles from his home. On Sunday, 18th of June, 1972, two young brothers were walking a dog in a field near Staines in southwest London, and they witnessed something amazing. The elder, the 13-year-old Trevor Burke, stated, "I looked up and I saw the plane. It was just coming down out of the mist when the engines stalled and it seemed to glide down. It was just like a dream. The plane just fell out of the sky." The aircraft, a British European Airways Hawker Siddeley Trident, having just taken off from Heathrow's runway 27 en route for Brussels, had, owing to a combination of technical defect and pilot error, deep stalled, fallen from the sky, coming to rest on a thin strip of land between the A30 trunk road in the lower left-hand corner there, trunk road straight into the centre of London, and a reservoir, which is just beyond the north of that picture. It was amazing that it didn't fall onto houses. The vertical impact killed instantly 116 people. The 117th victim died in Ashford Hospital a little bit later that afternoon. That's the map with the trajectory of the flight. Now, I'm touching on, of course, territory here that was touched on yesterday by Peter Gallison, the idea of the accident. Faced with the evidence that a fully laden passenger jet weighing 50 tons could, in the first moments of flight, fall to Earth, what grand design should be blamed? Should it be providence, the machinery of the gods, or should it be the arteriosclerosis of the pilot who seemed to have had a heart attack just after takeoff? Or should it be the aircraft's flawed aerodynamics? In a famous review of J.G. Ballard's novel Crash, the French thinker Jean Baudrillard claimed that technology is never glimpsed except in the accident. That is to say, in the violence done to technology itself and in the violence done to the body. He was talking really about cars there, but I think the terms of his discussion can be simply applied to the failure of any technological system, even an airport. As has been suggested so far, Ballard's work is fixated upon the ways that chance and contingency impact upon representation, upon modes of perception. But what kind of situations do the accidental and the unexpected inspire, imagine, or materialize in the context of an airport landscape? The French thinker Paul Virilio, whose work on the theory of accident was touched on yesterday by a question from the audience, is powerfully radical and implies a new relationship between catastrophe and thought. In his view, the substance of any technology leads directly to its accident, its breakdown. The invention of the aeroplane leads to the air crash. Perhaps also, could we say that the airport too has a similar trajectory, but is constantly trying to avoid it? Conversely, accidents initiate their own histories of aesthetic, epistemic, and ontological innovation. Put simply, any technical progress is expectant with catastrophe. And in what remains of today, I want to think about this idea of accident in relation not so much to a technology, but to what Ballard calls the technological landscape of the airport itself. I want to consider the ways in which the history and the situation of a landscape such as Heathrow's can actually be framed by notions of accidentality, if there is such a word, in the broadest sense. I'd like to ask what happens when airports collide with questions of risk and calculation, questions of security and control. What happens when their repeated unpredictability crashes into predictable repetition? The English cultural critic Stephen Bailey has observed, rightly, that London's major airports have developed, quote, by accident and not design. The story is well known, not even scandalous. The facility that was originally known as London Airport came about in 1944, almost haphazardly, when Harold Balfour, there he is, then Secretary of State for Air, realizing the need for a new air station close to the centre of London, applied a grid over a large-scale ordnance survey map of the southeast of England and found only one undeveloped place with the 7 square miles necessary for a developed airfield, Heathrow in Hounslow, a name which even announces the pastoral landscape which would disappear. The airport was started in 1944 and opened in 1946. And 3 years later, a Central Office of Information, that's to say a propaganda film made by the then British government, entitled London Airport gives the official line. But even then, it has to take account of the environmental damage. Could we play it, please? I've put the narration at the top there for you to follow, because it's a very strange English accent.
It was 7 square miles of quiet Middlesex countryside. It was in April 1944 that history came to these country fields.
Yeah, a voice from the
past. An airport was required to finish off the Japanese. An airport for heavy, far-flying aircraft. An immediate need with an eye to the peaceful future. That was the beginning. And the landscape was changed and the past obliterated. Then from the huge cement mills, oceans of concrete like heavy lava poured forth to form the solid runways.
To secure the straight and level, an airport necessarily obliterates the past. Hence the hamlet of Heathrow, first mentioned in 1453 and vacated by its residents almost 5 centuries later, now lies buried under a short-stay car park. Under Terminal 2, which has recently been redeveloped, lies one of the most important pre-Christian temples ever to have been found in Britain. As this film suggests, the experience of the locals would have been psychologically shattering. Thank you.
The local inhabitants, however, see things from a different angle. To the older ones, it must have seemed strange indeed to see giant aircraft roaring down paths that once they knew as pleasant loitering lanes. Stranger still to see the streams that they had known since childhood turned aside from their old winding courses to new straight concrete beds. And strange to see the familiar farms swept from the earth as though by a whirlwind. And surely the unkindest cut of all, a few of their pubs may have...
Well, the unkindest cut of all, the pubs have gone. But this implies that the uprooting and effacement of these ancient lives in Middlesex was by the force majeure of a natural disaster, a whirlwind. But London Airport, in its origins, was no accident. But since then, its planning has been accidental. The architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner, his first book in the Buildings of England series was on Middlesex, and published in 1951, the year of the charming Festival of Britain. And the write-up for Heathrow is very interesting, very revealing. London Airport, size approximately 4.5 square miles, ultimately to be 7 square miles. The final runway pattern is under construction at the time of writing. A dual parallel system of 6 runways, and so on and so forth. Architect for the future buildings, the hexagonal terminal area in the centre as yet undeveloped, so that no architectural features can be pointed out. Architect for the future buildings, Frederick Gibbard. The airport had been open for several years, but there seemed to be still so much that was to be settled, so much that was chance and accidental. It was more in line with Heath Robinson's makeshift contraptions and designs than an airport named Heathrow. Heath Robinson was Heathrow and vice versa. The plan by Frederick Gibbard, a very famous English town planner, most famous for the development of Harlow Newtown in Essex, saw the creation of a central area which will be accessed via a subway running underneath the original main runway. The focal point was a control tower, 122 feet high control tower, and a passenger terminal called the Europa Building, and an office block called the Queen's Building, and there they are. And when it opened in 1955, the claim was that it would meet Britain's civil aviation needs until the end of the century. But within a few years, it was already bursting at the seams. By the late 50s, the shrieking jets had arrived. But within a few, and by the early 60s, the terminals were being renamed, given numbers, terminals 1, 2, and 3, to imply that there was some kind of rational order behind them. But there was none. In the final paragraph of his essay on the ultimate departure lounge, Ballard says, "Even the old terminal buildings, 1, 2, and 3, have a certain period charm. Together, they and the main control tower represent the last survival of the Festival of Britain. I look forward to their replacement in due course, and to the new Terminal 5, and beyond that to Terminal 6 and 7, and the transformation of Britain into the ultimate departure lounge. After all, we have every reason to leave." For many, the best reason to leave Britain was the national airport itself, the squalid chaos of Heathrow, a result of old buildings struggling to cope with new circumstances. In London Orbital, his account of a walk around the M25 motorway, the motorway which encircles Britain's capital, Ian Sinclair describes how, quote, "river and road define the western limits of London Airport's piracy, the land grab that will never be satisfied. Terminals 5, 6, and 7, it's not enough. Flight zone must be bigger than the city it serves. Check-in queues will stretch back to that model Concorde on its traffic island, to the M4. Severed communities, such as Harmondsworth, are under threat. In time, West Drayton itself will be swallowed, a theatre of catastrophe in which all the global disasters play." Sinclair's impatience with Ballard's blithe celebration of the terminal numbering sequence is palpable, but at least even that small-scale Concorde has now flown off for good, created off into oblivion after an accident caused by a small piece of metal on a Paris runway in 2000 caused a full-sized Air France example to fireball into a motel near Roissy-Charles de Gaulle. But the insatiability of Heathrow continues. Even if the plans now seem more rational, these are the 3 current plans for the development of new runways at Heathrow, one to the northwest, one to the north, and one to the southwest, each of which would involve wholesale destruction of communities and villages. I'm sure as I'm standing here now, it'll go ahead. That 1949 film ended with a confident statement.
This now is London's airport. Out of the sky and into the sky, day and night the travellers come and go. Last year it was 400,000. Next year it will be many more. All this requires careful, intricate and precise organization, difficult enough under the best conditions. Yet here a major air junction is being operated while the buildings and runways are still growing up around it. This building will continue for perhaps 6 years yet, for its plans are vast. But in the end, no matter what the future of aircraft may be, Stratocruiser, Brabazon or Flying Wing, here will be an airfield second to none, for London Airport is on the map.
It makes me very proud standing here, knowing that London Airport is on the map. And of course, as Peter Gallison was saying yesterday, an airport, any airport, is held fast by its maps. Maps which define not simply its location, but also the strict procedures by which it can be approached or departed by air or land. These sorts of aeronautical charts that Peter showed you yesterday are designed to preempt accident, be it in the movements of the aircraft around the airport, in the flow of passengers through the terminal or in the impact of jet noise on the local environment. And they are now no deviation except in emergency. And what is striking is the extent to which some British writers, some recent British writers, notably Sinclair, have sought to make a space within this accidental landscape by running counter to the maps, going against the flows that they describe. The patent for this technique is this man, a Frenchman, Guy Debord, whose supposed big idea is psychogeography. Psychogeography is a kind of aimless tearing up of maps, a kind of disruptive force, a renovated cartography. And the psychogeographical theories emerged in Paris in the 1950s. They were a cult for a while, I suppose, but in the 1970s and 1980s, Debord died in 1984, by that time his theories had assumed quite an important cultural importance. Alas, French situationists had little to say about airport landscapes. They never got as far as Orly, and at the time, at the time they were flourishing, Charles de Gaulle was still only a chateau en Espagne. But over the last decade or so, a number of English writers have used the precepts of psychogeography to approach, finally, the airport landscapes lying in earshot of the suburbs west of London. This man is an interesting example, Will Self. If you'd ever travelled or walked to Heathrow 10 years ago, you might have met Will Self doing exactly the same. He had a big idea that he should walk from his house in central London to Heathrow Airport and fly to great airports in the world and then continue walking. Why? Well, for him, it was a means of asserting himself. It was a means of dealing with the increasing alienation from mass transit systems. He also said it was simply people don't walk to airports. But it's the work of Ian Sinclair which I think has looked deepest into this question of walking to and around airports. London Orbital is especially powerful. Having provided some sense of the history of the airport, his final approach to Heathrow in London Orbital is especially powerful. Windows shudder, tiles are threatened. Any day now, a brick of frozen shit, a lump of aircraft debris, a falling asylum seeker will crash through the roof. But with leaded panes, net curtains, white doors, beds of hardy perennials, carpet-sized lawns, the rustic fantasy thrives. You can't hear yourself speak. The flow of traffic is continuous and agitated. And that verb there, crash, is entirely right, since it also implies the soundscape, the soundtrack to the airport landscape. And it seems to me that we can't think of landscape, airport landscape, without also thinking about the role of sound. And here at this point, on the western edge of Heathrow, the landscape is swallowed and overridden by furiously competing narratives. Can we just go back? Oh, sorry. This one. This one, please. Thanks. Planes coming in at various heights. The vibrations shake our skeletons. Loosen fillings, the madness of this pilgrimage through a landscape that challenges or defies walkers is a pure adrenaline rush. The vortex, planes, vans, airport buses, tremendous discriminations of noise. Discriminations of noise filling the air. Discriminations meaning varied in form, but also prejudicial to welfare. And it makes it very difficult for Sinclair to follow the line to the end, to the airport, to escape the endless present ever in earshot. This kind of noise has featured, and I'm just wrapping up now, but this kind of noise has featured a great deal in the work of Ballard, the blare and drone of airliners around the airport and above the city. One of his last novels, Millennium People, represents his final approach to the landscape of Heathrow. That beached sky city, half space station and half shantytown, haunted and overshadowed by sounds emerging from the jets that define its spaces. The plot begins with an explosion in Terminal 2, a man-made accident, as it were. But the noise that hangs over the novel is not the noise of explosion, but the inimitable howl of the turbofan. The novel climaxes at a disused asylum right under the flight path of runway 27 of Heathrow. A good place for a madhouse, we're told. You can't hear anyone scream. That asylum has been turned into a children's hospital. Now, there's a kind of extreme version of situationism going on here. And there's the climactic exchange between Gould, a psychologist, a child psychologist, and Markham, an adult psychologist. They're distracted by the noise of the jet. Gould shielded his eyes, watching an airliner lift itself from the runway. It braced its wings against the sky, a titanic effort of steel and will. As it rose over Bedfont and turned towards the west, Gould waved admiringly. Heroic, but not pointless enough. Exactly. It would be better if the plane crashed. Yes, that would mean something. What an idea. The revelation imagined here is that in the silence after an accident befalling a Titanic airliner, the airport landscape that Ballard described in Crash as elaborately signaled is now transformed to become an empty space, inexplicable and mysterious. There is naturally a critical point between the planned and the unplanned, the deliberate and the accidental. Contemporary technological trends and risk analyses drive us towards a diminution of the spaces in which the unplanned might take place. Can we play the slide, please? Signs that pointed to nothing. Nothing, that is, except the airliners howling through its airspace and across its landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for the soundscape performance. We're going to move on to Philippe Coignet. Philippe Coignet is a landscape architect and the director of the Paris-based Office of Landscape Morphology. He was named Best Young Landscape Architect by the Ministry of Culture in Paris in 2008. And he is taught at the ETH School of Architecture in Zurich and at the School of Architecture Paris Malaquais and at Harvard University, and actually teaching even this morning. So please join me in welcoming Philippe.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess a lot of you know the project already, and I had to go to the archives to look for better or more images to explain you the project. Okay. So, about 5 miles away from downtown Athens, The Hellenikon airport was built in 1938 along the sea on former agricultural fields. The image on the right shows the airport before it was closed in 2001. The main terminal was built by Eero Saarinen, and the airport was almost covered by concrete and asphalt surfaces. 2/3 of the site, of the 550 hectares, was hard surface, creating a huge retention system, causing many flooding issues during summer. The ground became almost sealed, and it's almost insane to think about a park in this condition. The airport had two main runways, a 3.5 kilometer and a 3.2 kilometer from the east to the west, and another one of 2 kilometers perpendicular to it. It's like this one here. The site is set at an average elevation of 21 meters high, but this is an important data, as in fact the airport sits from 60 meters above here to 5 meters here along the sea. So in fact, the 21 meters is only an average at this location to give an indication. The airport was the host of the summer 2004 Olympic Games on half of the site, which is this part here. They didn't touch the other part here, and only on this one, there was part of the Olympic Games. The sport facilities were distributed either on the former meadows for soccer and baseball fields and on hard surfaces for other activities. The 747 maintenance hangars were converted into basketball and handball terrains. Today, all the stands, the tribunes, and the fields are still in place, even if there's no baseball team in Greece, for example. In 2004, after the end of the Games, the competition brief asked for a new urban development to generate enough income to finance the 21st Metropolitan Urban Park with, and I quote, green areas, cultural, sports, and leisure facilities, as well as housing, retails, and offices. Before any attempt to design something, we started to look at the site before the airport, and we were interested in the former irrigation system that existed as a way to connect the mountains on the top to the sea, but as well as to water the agricultural fields. And in a period of 80 years, the city and the airport replaced the fields. The streams have been buried and channelized into a complex network system of trenches, pipes, and swales. At a large scale, we map the catchment basins and track the smaller inlets, the streams, the channels, and ditches and rivers to understand where the rainwater was sent from the surrounding mountains up to the sea. At the scale of the airport, the runways and asphalt surfaces have swales or tubes everywhere to collect rainwater from the center of the airport to the former streams. Here on each side of the airport, you have like existing streams that have been channelized. I'm going to show you how they actually constructed that. This is the example of one of the two existing streams that were actually channelized or asphalt to evacuate as fast as possible the water. The scale of the infrastructure is enormous. It's about 4 meters tall here by 16 meters wide. 16 meters, a 2-lane road plus sidewalk plus planting. So you can evacuate a lot of like cubic gallons of water per second through this system. And of course, the water is sent back to the sea. So almost 10 years ago, we quite didn't know what was a 21st century park, and I'm not sure I know it better today. But I knew that we could not grow a park on top of deep concrete surface. One of the information we had, and I'm not sure it's really accurate, is that when a 747 hits the ground, so maybe you know it better than me, but the asphalt and compacted earth below can be up to 4 meters deep. Even if this number is maybe exaggerated, we thought we had to touch as less as possible the ground in order to generate the park and to invest the money at the right place. With the architect David Serrero, who at that time was in New York, we came up with the idea that before anything else, the project should focus on the construction of a new ground, both as a tool to generate the park and a new structure to create the urban settings. The project seeks to develop a design process and a time sequence strategy based on rainwater collection and topographic modifications. A series of 6 corridors, this one, the 6th one is here, of 200 to 300 meters wide is established to link the existing city on the upper level to the coastline 60 meters below. These corridors, or softscapes as we call them, integrate a new drainage system as well as new programs. The second strategy, this one, is to maximize the relationship between park and city in amplifying the edge so each neighborhood could have a relationship to the park. The goal was to increase interaction between the park and the buildings, and therefore the real estate value of the development of housing, retails, and offices, either on the upper part of the park, here, or the lower part of the park. In doing so, we actually estimated to increase the linearity by 4 times, the relationship between the park and the building, 4 times higher as if we had proposed a straight line between the two systems, like Central Park, for example. The third strategy on top was to keep all the runways. The huge scale, the remaining airport facilities, and concrete navigation devices define the main visual and circulation axis of the park. What we call horizontal monuments are the links between the softscapes where buses, bikers, runners, pedestrians can move freely on the hard surface. In terms of operational strategy, the goal, as you understand, was to catch up a maximum of water from the surroundings and from the site, and to conduct it into the 6 softscapes in order to create the necessary condition to establish the park. One of the Greek hydrologists that we worked with had a heart attack when he saw this for the first time, but we know this was the primary conditions to elaborate the design process. In fact, he was the guy who designed the ditches before. This is the existing topography. It seems quite simple, but it took us many months actually to get it from the Greek Ministry of Environment, as they didn't know why it was useful to do the park. In fact, they told us, you know, it's flat, so you don't need topography. I said, sure, it's flat from here to here, but it's not flat from here to here. So they gave us points every 10 meters, so you can imagine how accurate was the design at the beginning. Based upon the natural irrigation, we proposed to develop and extend the system with a softscape, which links the city and the park, combines soft programming and a water management strategy. On days of high precipitations, water flow is channeled, delayed, and temporarily stored within the softscapes, and I will show that later. Rather than projecting an artificial landscape on the site, the system uses existing conditions and establishes the roots for a natural ecosystem which channels and distributes resources to the park vegetation and reduces the park maintenance. This is the first experiment on the relationship between the softscapes and the site, and which helped us to calculate that we were transforming less than 20% of the overall site, of the overall surface of the airport. The channels or softscapes are integrated system articulated around 5 main components: topography, water, planting, circulation, and programs. And of course, this assemblage of these different components is different on every softscape according to the width, the depth, or the amount of water that is needed to actually water the surface of the park. Doing some models, and we can fact that at the scale of the site, they are very discrete topographic maneuvers. They are very shallow and very small, in fact. You know, it seems like a big gesture. I think the first models we did, actually, well, I think we got something wrong with the scale, so we didn't know exactly what to do. So I think we went back. These were the first model, and these were the second model. I think a lot more successful. We didn't have milling at that time, unfortunately. So we first created sections, taking a wide range of possibilities without any preconception of what was best. We tested many iterations of the ground, from the flat to vertical structures that had a capacity to hold the program, to be planted, to go under the runways, to stock water, and so on. By lofting the sections together, we started to see some emergent figures that had the capacity to hold the program in them. So these were one of the, I think, 75 trials we did in trying to get the best topography that we wanted to have. So what do these Softscape do, actually? They actually hold 12 reservoirs. So basically in each Softscape you have a number of reservoirs that are placed at different locations in order to let the water be diffused slowly through the entire park during a 5-month period. We scale the reservoir to stock enough water during the dry seasons from May to October. So the idea is, like, when we collect the water from the surroundings, the water is sent to a first reservoir, a second reservoir, and then it's diffusing along, of course, the Softscapes and perpendicular to it through these different swales and small channels we wanted to create. The planting strategy is developed around the strict use of on-site collected rainwater and around a limited number of species. In proposing to work on the Softscapes in the first phase, we have begun to elaborate an intensive and extensive planting strategy. Both of them were specifically imagined according to the maintenance regime, the moisture of the ground, the slope, the species, and the program. This strategy was based upon 2 very simple rules. The first one was to plant massively the Softscape with 2 to 3 years old trees in order to make them as visible as possible. What you see here is a research on plant density, the distance in between the trees, and some reference from the Reservoirs Park that Christophe talked about yesterday. The second rule was to use the amount of water collected and no more. We calculated precisely what we could stock, how much water could evaporate. It's about what we learned over there is like about 1/3 of the water could evaporate. So we had to store more than what we imagined at the beginning. And of course, the amount of water that could infiltrate into the ground in order to get the right density between ground covers, shrubs, and trees. The story is that about 3 years ago, we were asked to study the idea to plant big trees everywhere. That was a command from the Greek Ministry of Environment. And they wanted, I don't know why, but sometimes big figures, they are magical. So they asked us to plant 200,000 trees. I have no idea why 200,000, but we estimated that the on-site resources were not enough to water the trees, and on top of it, I don't think it made sense at all. So the phasing is something like this. There is the existing condition here, the topography here. Then the topographic transformation will be the first to emerge here, acting as spines across the park. Once we establish them, vegetation, circulation, and program will expand and thicken them on a time basis. So pioneer plants will be implemented and will colonize the site to prepare the ground for trees such as pine, olive, and oaks in function of wet and dry areas. Then that's basically the first phasing, and then the system gets more mature, and we roughly estimated that we could actually do this on a 20 years period of time, and from what I heard this morning from Adrian, that's about the time that these birch trees actually get matured as well. Here's a zoom on the reservoir, the planting, and the program. It's a very simple design, in fact. The third rule we actually invented. I don't know if we invented something, but we wanted to, of course, to balance the cut and fill. So what we said is like we shouldn't go under 10 meters below the existing ground and not over 10 meters as well. So in order to, you see the cubic meter here. It's not quite a good balance here. That was at the time when we stopped the design. but the idea was to actually not evacuate any ground outside of the airport. So we finally came up with a proposal that addresses the entire site. Not all the softscapes get into the shoreline, of course. Some of them stop at the main boulevard here. And only one is transformed into a large beach, taking into account the Olympic Games sport facilities. The east-west runway, partially covered by the Olympic Village, here, is extended towards the sea, bridging over the highway to create a direct connection to the shore. Sorry, it was this one. We kind of like extended this one to create a huge platform. The large concrete decks are preserved and create internal pedestrian boulevard. The lawns between the former runways are reinvestigated as a series of new platforms for lounging, playing, and contemplating the sea. To quickly end up, here's of course, the existing condition with the sports fields at the back. That's why they actually cut the site into 2 different pieces. The golf course here that existed before that actually pumps up the water from the underground table, and it pumps up the water from below the airport, so we actually couldn't actually recharge the underground table with the water we collected, so it had to be completely independent from each other. Then the attempt is to create this new system and kind of like placing the retails and shopping malls, the different housing, offices should go here. And kind of like you see what we call the corrugated edge. It's like these maximizing lines. So every place, every neighborhood should have a contact with the park. And then it's phase 2 or phase whatever. So what's next? Because this was done 10 years ago already. In 2011, about 2 years ago, the management and development of Hellenikon Airport land property was created to develop and sell the site to private investors. They are currently opening up the bids of 4 developers from England, Israel, Qatar, and Greece at a price of 5 billion euros. The goal is again to create a mixed-use development, but this time based upon the 3 green streams and a starfish shape. As we all know, the starfish shape has a capacity to generate complex and interesting landscape projects, as it is. So, my dear friends, landscape architects, I think it's maybe time to do a new competition to design the starfish. Thank you.